Hello there, this is Zephyr, and this is part 3 of a series where I read through the Salt Sanctuary patch notes that I have been involved with. So if you're interested in something like charms, buffs, and stats, go check out episode 2. If you're interested in more of the bug fixes and quality of life stuff, check out episode 1. So we're going to be talking about monsters. A lot of this is primarily for bosses, and I just want to cover some numbers real quick at the top here. So the armor calculation in Salt and Sanctuary is this, where armor divided by the sum of armor plus 200 equals the value of damage reduction. So at 200 armor, you will have 50% damage reduction. At 400 armor, you will have 66% damage reduction. At 600 armor, you'll have 75% damage reduction, and so on and so forth, where every 200 armor that your character or the enemy acquires will reduce damage by approximately 100% of the base. In other words, you get a 100% effective health percentage. So, that aside, Salt Bat from 800 elemental resist to 250. This is primarily an issue in New Game Plus and beyond, where players are playing as mages or they're using a lot of elemental or poison damage and they can't kill the bat. It scales up pretty quickly, so I just reduced that down a bit after talking to a handful of players that had talked about this specific issue when you're going a full elemental run. That includes poison. Tree of Men. One of our favorites. Actually, it is literally one of my favorites. Tree of Men, fire defense from 50 to 600. Lightning defense from 50 to negative 40, and minions are now also weak to lightning, but have no other defensive or health changes. So let's talk about Tree of Men real quick. I found it weird that he did not have fire defense. Now, in patch 12, which is either out or will be coming out soon, depending on when this video releases, I have made it so that bosses, not all enemies, but bosses have a maximum defense of 600 to any given element or type. So this is a buff to some bosses, this is a nerf to others, but that 600 means that it has 75% damage reduction at the max. So Tree of Men now has that cap of 75% damage reduction from all fire damage, which makes sense. He's kind of literally on fire and is made of metal and all this other stuff. So, Kraken Worm. Fire defense has been increased similarly to 300, not quite the 600 of Tree of Men. It's an earlier boss, and so I wanted to keep that in line with kind of the point in which you find it. And there's a lot of stuff with massive fire defense in that region right after, with the Red Hollow Cages, of course, and the Tree of Men itself. So lightning defense has been similarly negated or turned negative here. So Tree of Men and Kraken Worm are the only bosses with lightning weakness. They were previously no bosses with lightning weakness. So that was something that was a bit lacking in the pattern of bosses here. Interestingly enough, that there is a pickup of Shockstone at the front of the Castle of Storms, which makes this change relatively perfect in my opinion, because it teaches you yet again the weakness of the boss that you're about to face. So there's a holy pickup right in front of Queen of Smiles, for example, in the same fashion. I didn't create that situation where I am creating this one. Slash defense from 250 to 300, just to bring it up to kind of a same number. Strike defense from 100 to 50, so it is sort of weak to strike now, which makes more sense. It was kind of strong to strike while also still being strong to slash. And so just moving that around a little bit, one going up, one going down, should help communicate the weaknesses a little bit better. And stagger defense is been increased from 100 to 160, which helps remove some actually AI glitches with how it lands, takes off, and does some other stuff. There are some planned changes to the AI of the Kraken Worm. They're not in this patch. I don't know exactly how they're going to be executed yet, but it should help with specifically it flying around too much. It will have a numerical cap to how many times it can do a drive-by. And it will also have some very high resistance poise defense, kind of a hyper armor when it's landing and taking off to help remove some AI gimmickiness. Those are not guaranteed, just theorized. We'll see how it gets executed in the long run here. Karstja, dark defense from 0 to 600. He is definitely a dark character. His armor is either the highest or one of the highest arcane defense armors in the game. So it just made sense. Fire, Lightning, Holy defense set to 100. He previously just didn't have defenses. So Dark, Lightning, Fire, Holy were all 0. Poison defense, I think, was also 0, set to 200. So he's a little bit defensive to poison. And then HP from 1250, a very measly amount of defense, to 2250, which will make him actually show his second phase. Yes, he has a second phase. I've actually had multiple people ask, did I add that? No, I did not add that. It has always been there. You were just used to four-shotting him with a great weapon and some kind of buff. His poise has gone from 90 to 160. He's a relatively slow boss, so staggering him with really any weapon or any effect just made him even more trivial. So hopefully he is less trivial here. He is still a very slow boss, though. He hits hard. His damage has not been changed. Nothing in that regard. So, yeah. Cut the yeah. False Jester. Strike defense from 300 to 100. All elements excluding poison have now been buffed to 100 as well. So the False Jester is wearing very, very little. He's got a jester's hat and some vest on and some pants and stuff. He had this crazy high strike defense. And you have this situation where there are 3 or so bosses in a row, and this happens a few times. There are 3 or so bosses in a row that have really high strike defense. So the game is really punishing you for using a strike weapon in that moment. I wanted to alleviate this by adjusting just 1 or 2 enemies downwards in their strike defense. They might still be relatively defensive to those damage types, but they're not going to be as wall-inducing as they previously were. So False Jester is no longer a strike defense heavy target. Still has 100 though. So mathematically speaking, the difference of this is 3/5 or 60% damage reduction down to 1/3 or 33.3%. And that's for all the elements and strike defense, excluding poison. Untouched Inquisitor. The Dome of the Forgotten is a weird place where it is, I believe, the first place a mimic shows up, as well as you've got all sorts of other stuff going on. There's a lot of mechanics being thrown at you in this area. And you have a mimic, you have invisible enemies, you have some platforms that are going in and out of existence. So there's a lot going on here. And then you get to the Untouched Inquisitor. And I'm not saying she's the easiest boss in the world, but I do think that she does not prepare you for the Lamb boss fight above. Lamb in classic mode or the original game had 2,500 health. Just down here, there's a reference to it. 2,500 health. So I increased the Untouched Inquisitor to kind of show you that this area is a higher level than just simply another alternate path. It is a relatively large increase of 25%, but I've personally never really had strong difficulty with the Inquisitor. The Third Lamb, possibly my least favorite boss. The Third Lamb has been adjusted kind of a lot here. The fire and dark defense, or arcane defense, has been increased from -23, which is a weird number that doesn't exist on any other boss or enemy, to -40. Slash defense was the only negative physical damage in the game for some reason, again at -23, a weird number, and that has been changed to 0. So instead of doing 13% amplification of damage with slash, you will do no amplification and no damage reduction. Now, the third lamb does have 10% less health, so it's push and pull in every direction here. So fire and arcane defense, you're going to hit it way harder with fire and arcane. You're going to hit it kind of similarly with slash. Lightning defense has been increased significantly. Again, that's a 75% reduction. So 600 being the new cap on bosses means that this boss is extremely defensive to lightning, which again makes sense. It shoots lightning at you. That's its primary form of attack. 80% of its attacks are just forms of lightning, and the rest is a couple physical attacks and a poison stab. Holy defense has been increased as well to 150, and poison defense has been decreased from 900 to 600. So 900 is somewhere around, I think, 80% something, 84% something. And going down to 75%, it's going to help you not have a situation where it takes 50, 60 hits. So normalization towards kind of the middle. So if you have a fire weapon or pure fire damage, such as like fireball or wildfire or whatnot, you're maybe going to kill this boss in 10 hits, 15 hits probably at the most, depending on your level and your skills and whatnot you're doing with your character. But if you're going in there with, say, lightning damage, you're probably going to take 4 or even 5 times that many hits to kill her. So third lamb definitely has had some adjustments here. But the poison defense one specifically is meant to kind of pull down the extremely long situation of getting caught with a boss that has a relatively insanely high amount of defense. The purpose of this change with poison defense is to make it so that you just don't have this extreme circumstance of one player killing the boss in 8 hits and another player taking 100 hits or 60 hits or something to kill the boss. So one player might be able to kill the boss in 8 hits or 12 hits. Another player might be able to kill it in 40 or 45 hits, but not 60 hits. And that's kind of the intended purpose of these changes for some of these higher defense values. You're still not intended to beat them with that damage type. You're still going to struggle if you use that damage type. You're just not going to have to sit there for 15 minutes to do it. And as I mentioned, health has been reduced from 2,500 to 2,250. The third lamb has one of the highest health pools in the game, especially up to this point. The Nameless God has only 2,000 health. The Tree of Men has like 1,300. So this is a huge jump, especially if you skip the red hall and you just go to the right, and you're just going to hit this wall of defense, this wall of the third lamb's health. It's a very aggressive boss as well, so you're going to have a little bit less time to deal with the first and second threshold of rage mode. I do believe the third lamb has a 50% threshold as well as a 25% threshold for aggressiveness. Ronin Cran. A boss fight that kind of ends quickly sometimes. Fire and lightning defense has been increased to 100, and holy arcane poison defense from 25 to 100. So Cran is heavily armored. It makes sense that he would actually be resistant to quite a few things, but these aren't crazy high resistances. This isn't a 500 or a 300 or whatnot. However, when Cran actually uses his potion, it is actually golden wine. So golden wine gets placed on Ronin Cran. He gets an extra buff of 100% bonus poise damage as well, that the player does not get. And so he's going to gain 100 to all physical damage types, which includes poison in certain circumstances. And Golden Wine is one of those circumstances. So poison damage is kind of considered a physical damage type in certain circumstances. So he will have 300 poison defense, and he will have quite a bit of fire, lightning, and such defense that will be pushed to 100. So poison defense is not affected by Golden Wine when used on the player. Ronan Cran is technically just reusing that buff, and it will not be changed for him, only the player. I'll touch on Golden Wine later on, but I just wanted to mention that in Enhanced, Golden Wine does not give poison defense to the player. There's also some potential AI adjustments for Ronan Cran. Again, unsure how this will be executed. It is going to be a future patch. So his AI may be adjusted in certain circumstances so that he does not get confused with whether or not he is currently buffed or not. That is a situation where he will sometimes, but not always, try to buff himself either right away or shortly after having buffed himself, where he gets caught in a little loop. And we'll probably just put a timer on that so that he isn't just instantly using it, or even making it so that he has to wait for it to run out to start it over again. Similarly, we may adjust some of his HP and defense associated with some situations there. Maybe he has hyper armor, maybe not, in certain moments of the fight. Similar to the Kraken Worm. It's meant to adjust the AI, not necessarily make the boss fight itself significantly different or harder. The Disemboweled Husk. In a previous version of Enhanced, strike defense was decreased for this boss. I have reverted this and left it at 500. So there is a little bit less of the strike defense changes across the board in regards to bosses having a lot of it. Fire defense has been increased from 0 to 50, and holy defense has been adjusted from -50 to -40. Now, this -40 number, I'm using it for all forms of weaknesses on bosses, and primarily across the game, there were -50s a lot on enemies. So all the -50s have become -40s. And the difference of this is amplification of damage by 1/3 to amplification of damage by 1/4 instead. So 8.33% point shift of damage there. Stench Most Foul. Another boss that was pretty easy and pushover. He does have a bug fix in the base patch, back in patch 9 or so. So his minions can actually re-enter the arena. They were being treated as regular enemies and not part of the actual boss fight. So they'd get stuck behind the fog wall, which is invisible in this game, and not be able to re-enter. They can now re-enter, and they can go out just as well. So they can move in either direction, similar to most bosses. Poison defense has been significantly increased to 600. Fire defense has been adjusted, and holy defense has been adjusted to the new weakness value of 25% amplification to damage. His health has also been increased from 1600 to 2000. That is a 25% increase in health. So he will last a little bit longer. Minions also have the same resistance as this boss. They're basically breakoffs of the boss, so I didn't want them to be significantly different, and they were slightly different in a lot of their numbers, and I didn't feel that that was an important thing to retain. Their HP has also been increased by 25%. So this boss isn't probably going to be as significant of a challenge as it may sound. A lot of these changes make him survive just a little bit longer and be a little bit more of a threat. But if you go in with Antidote and you dodge his like one physical attack, then he's still a pushover. He's still going to go down. You might die to him once, primarily to the bug fix change, because players may not be used to having the actual minions be a threat. And due to the increase on the minion HP as well as the boss, the minions may take just a little bit more to get rid of, even with some of the better weapons in the game. Now, if you're using a great weapon, it's probably going to feel about the same, even though great weapons were adjusted downwards. Witch of the Lake, everyone's favorite boss, right up there with Tree of Men, has a little bit less weakness to Fire and Holy. Same adjustment there. And a weird notice that I found out was that her salt drop was ridiculously low for her point in the game and would often not give you a full level because of it. So the boss right after her is 24,000, and the boss right before her is somewhere between 18,000 and 20,000, depending on the kind of the path you do and if you do a boss skip. So I just kind of put her right in the middle there. So she'll give 22,000 salt instead of 12,000 salt. A note on this is bosses always drop the amount of salt plus 10 as their gold value. So, and that's not true in New Game Plus, but that is true in normal New Game. So her gold drop will also have that same 10,000 increase because that's just how the game calculates gold drop on enemies. Bosses are a little bit different than regular enemies and always drop in 10 piles, and each pile has a minimum of 1 gold. So that's why it's always the salt drop plus 10. The Architect and the Unskinned. I really enjoy this fight, but I felt like some of the defenses made less sense than normal, probably. So I have adjusted this in a bunch of different ways. Strike defense has been reduced, so you're not going to have as much of a strong frustration with strike defense itself, but her health has been increased by 300, which is pretty significant. Give and take there. So every player will have a little bit more to deal with the Architect, but strike defense won't be specifically as punished. Same with the Unskinned. The Unskinned has been standardized to be basically a Hulk with no armor, so his strike defense and slash defense is now 50 and 50 both, to kind of show that you probably shouldn't be using physical damage here. The Unskinned had extremely low poise. A lot of bosses, even the disemboweled husk, have something like 200 poise. And the Unskinned only had 100, so he was able to be staggered pretty regularly. Basically, 3 hits from a great weapon would stagger the Unskinned. So poise defense has been increased to 200 to be in line with actually many other bosses, and elemental defenses have been adjusted downward so that they are less effective. Similar to, of course, all the other negative 50s. So the Unskinned is going to be the kind of hulking enemy that you kill with elemental damage if you want to. It has a high amount of health. Its health has also been increased by 25%, just as the Architect has. And you're going to have to eat through the health, but you're not going to have to eat through high defenses. So meat shield, literally, meat shield. The 3. The 3 is this weird situation where I feel like some people struggle and other people think that it's one of the easiest bosses possible, in the sense that it is a relatively simple boss with 3 pieces. And once you take down one of the 3, the other 2 are usually no more of a threat from there on. So in Classic, just to preface some of these changes, in Classic, the 3 feel like kind of pushovers for the most part. The Judge is probably your biggest threat for damage, as the Judge does really high damage comparatively to the other 2. And then you get into New Game Plus 1. And instead of having 1,200 health, all of these guys have 4,500 health. One of the largest jumps in power and damage. They also go from a 1.0 multiplier to a 5.25 multiplier. So the New Game Plus jump is one of the strongest, craziest things in the game for the 3. And the Architect and Unskinned have also been adjusted similarly in past versions of Enhanced, as well as the patch 12 has been adjusting some of these things too. So the three have cumulatively a large health pool, but individually, once you take out one, you're probably not going to struggle with the last two. Not much, anyways. Hopefully, hopefully. So just a 50 health nudge, just to kind of bring them up with something like the Untouched Inquisitor being that kind of rounder number, if you will. Dark defense on the Dead Judge has been reduced to -40, like many of the other bosses with their weaknesses, and the fire defense on the other two has been adjusted towards -40, of course, as well. The Dead King had no dark defense, and I wanted to give him something. So dark defense to positive 150 on both the King and the Knight. So you've got the Judge weak to it, and the Knight and King mildly strong to it. Not quite 50% damage reduction there. And then the Dead Knight has had some adjustments further because he is more heavily armored than the King and is probably a better fighter, if you will. His damage has been increased by 25%. Again, this is really low damage to begin with. So 25% is not that much. Just because you're starting from a base of very little. And then his slash defense has been increased. So the Dead Knight is strongest to slash. The Dead King is medium to slash, and the Dead Judge is strong versus strike. And that's unchanged. Nerdy LML. Holy defense from 0 to 600. Dark defense from 0 to 300. This is just some basic changes. She is the holy boss of the game, basically. So it made sense to give her, of anybody, a 600 holy defense because there just really isn't a lot of holy resistance in the game because everything is kind of undead or cursed or kraken or whatever. So I give her holy defense. Dark defense has also been increased. She is both kraken, ethereal, doesn't drop any salt because she's not real. She's more of a projection, all this other stuff. So she is both holy and dark defense as well. Shouldn't really change her. If you have a shield that can block 100% holy damage, then she literally can't do damage anyways. She has no physical attacks. The Dried King. His poison defense has been adjusted to the maximum of 600 for bosses and can no longer be pushed by general attack knockback. There were some situations where you could knock him into the side of the arena, and for whatever reason, he would get stuck or just choose not to walk towards you, which would create a situation where all of his attacks are centered on himself. He is meant to kind of stay in the middle of the room, and he can still move around. He still has movement, but he can no longer be abused by knockback in this fashion. And that's primarily more of an AI kind of focus change where, again, he doesn't know that you're on the other side of the arena because he's expecting you to be either on his left side or his right side. Skurs. Lightning defense from 1,000 to 600. So Skurs is going to be easier to deal with lightning damage if that's what you've gone for. Fire defense has been increased. Now, 1,000 defense is 10 over 12, if you want to do that math. So it's a lot of defense. 600 is 75% damage reduction. So we're going from something like 90% damage reduction to 75% damage reduction. You're not going to two-shot him with lightning damage. You're still going to struggle. But you're going to be able to actually finish the fight now and not have to take 15 minutes like I've mentioned before. Nameless God. Nameless God is an interesting boss. In many ways, you could say that he is a living embodiment of something. And in that something, he is effectively an enchanted armor. He is God of the Kraken. He is kind of this enchanted armor. He's supposed to have crazy high defenses and simultaneously has very low health. So a lot of the late game bosses have 3,000 or even 3,500, 2,500, that kind of stuff. And then you get to the final boss, and the final boss is 2,000. He had one of the lowest poise defenses of any boss in the game at 90. So that's been buffed up to 160. You're not going to stagger him as much. And his strike defense, due to some normalization efforts here, has been pumped up to 50. So you're going to do about 20% less damage to him with strike damage. So there were situations where you could 4 or even 3-shot this boss in Classic, maybe even 2-shot if you used a heavy charged attack and a great weapon and some corner cases that no longer exist in Enhanced. And so this just kind of normalizes him to be this tanky brute. He's kind of quick. He's got a bunch of different moves. He grabs you, all this other stuff. But when you beat him, and spoilers, of course, and when you beat him and you take the Dominion ending, you wake up in that armor because you put it on. Because all in all, in a way, and this is only my interpretation, this is not official lore, doctrine, whatever you want to call it, but he is really, truly kind of an unkillable spirit enchanted in an armor. He is something that represents something else in some way. If you look in the Crypt of Dead Gods, you'll see him and his armor hanging all over the place. There's just duplicate copies all over of what looks like the Nameless God. So take that for what you will, make up what you want. There's no official lore there. Have fun with it. Ember Skulls. Fire defense has been flipped with slash defense so that they're stronger versus fire. They're literally on fire, so the fact that they were actually not very weak to fire, or not very strong to fire, bothered me. I flipped them around. I also did some modified attack animation on Ember Skulls because that also, there were some issues with that. It was harder to read. Hopefully it's easier to read. Now you can jump the attack. So if you're pinned from both sides and you jump and they both attack at relatively similar times, you will be able to jump over them. They attack a little bit lower and they actually back up and enlarge themselves before releasing, so to say, like a pinball towards you. If you have lighter armor, you can actually walk away from them if you're walking in the same direction that they're attacking, as in away from them, not towards them. Then you will get hit if you walk towards them. So just some mild adjustments to kind of make those more Metroidvania kind of enemies that you can avoid in a couple different ways and easier to read, hopefully. Otherwise, it's just a small defense shift. Hangman. Another high strike defense enemy. Another high strike defense enemy just kind of being reduced so that you're not stuck with a situation you can't get out of. Hangmen are relatively obnoxious. They have a very large leash. They will follow you for multiple rooms if you aggro them. And so if you can't kill them, they don't have a lot of health, but if you're stuck with a mace, you're not going to be able to get into your inventory and your swap or whatever to go kill them. And you probably don't want to either. So still some defense to it. Just, you know, instead of 5 hits, maybe it's 3 with a one-hander. Thing of Arms had no defenses, so I gave them some weakness and some defense. Poison defense, because they're weird. Armor Might, same thing, gave them some defenses. Eye Scorpion had some really crazy high 800 poison and holy resists, and I gave them the same defenses as the Heartseeker, which changes the poison and holy resists to -40. The Heartseeker being the other eye enemy. The Crypt Keeper, Fire Holy Arcane Poison from 0 to 50. That's a lot of names there. Lightning was not increased, but the other elements and poison were increased to 50. So they're just a little bit more defensive and less pushover to, say, mages and elemental damage. There's a lot of situations where elemental damage just strongly outscales physical damage, and you already have a lot of ranged effects on that elemental damage from mages and stuff. So you have the safety of the range as well as the value of the high damage elements. So this just kind of offsets that just slightly, especially since they're kind of a slower enemy. Wrathful Dead had arcane defense of 50. I just wanted to give them something a little more thematic because they don't have a whole lot of anything else going for them. So 250 arcane defense. And then the Drowned Porcelain strangely had 10 strike defense. I don't think anything else has that low of a value for defense. Just a weird number. So I just slapped on an extra 0 relatively recently. And so they have just a little bit, you know, of an actual defense there instead of a rounding error of damage. So one of the things as a designer here, one of the things I'm looking at here is if you hit the enemy, are you going to notice the difference of 10 armor? It's probably too small to notice. And because Salt and Sanctuary gives you damage numbers, even the damage numbers are probably not going to be that much changed. It could be a situation where it's not even enough to really adjust the number. Like I said, it's literally a rounding error. So at 100 strike defense or even 50 strike defense, if I gave them that, you would actually see the number go down, which tells you, it communicates to the player, hey, this enemy is strong versus this damage type. And not all games use damage numbers to show this, but in this situation, Salt does use damage numbers. So that is something that needs to be more visible, in my opinion. New game boss, HP bonus to multiple boss fights has been reduced. I mentioned this already with the 3. The Architect and the Unskin are also reduced. So in all forms of New Game Plus, the Architect and the 3 in Enhanced have something like 20%, 25% less health gain. So in Classic, the 3 have 4550 HP, 4,550 HP each. In Enhanced, they each have 3,500 HP. On the release of Enhanced, they had 3,300. So I'm bumping it up from patch 10 in patch 12 here. Similar to the Architect and the Unskinned, they also had the normal calculation, which was just to add a huge amount of health to every boss, without consideration, of course, to the fact that these were not normal bosses, and the health pool, in effect, is split across multiple bosses instead. So the Architect and the Unskinned have changed values as well in Enhanced, and in patch 12, all bosses now have a template, code-based template for their HP, so that their HP has a basis point in New Game Plus and is a more round number at that point instead of a pure calculation, basically pre-calculated values. So the Architect and the Unskinned will scale separately because of this, to allow a better scaling overall. So the Architect will always have something around 25% less health than the Unskinned, instead of the Classic version where they kind of merge towards both being really high. In the case of the Architect and the Unskinned, they both actually had more health in New Game Plus, whereas in Enhanced, they now have less health in New Game Plus and more health in New Game. So I already mentioned the Ember Skull attack animation. The Architect boss fight itself has been changed, so she can no longer overlap her holy orbs. What does this mean? It means that there is a lot more area denial in the boss fight. So what I've done here is, this does make the boss fight in some ways harder. It makes it also more normalized again. If an orb is somewhere in the room, you can always roll through it. At least at roll 1 and roll 2 for sure. You can always roll through it. There will not be another orb sitting overlapping on that orb to make it, 10% longer in the room, or just slightly vertical of it so that you roll and stand up and instantly get hit. So you can potentially get ping-ponged more. And because the Architect's Holy Orbs were originally 100% RNG, completely random, there were situations where one player would experience a lot of area denial and another player would have 6 orbs, it's always 6, kind of stacked in a very small area, which meant that you were legitimately trapped. Sometimes they would even spawn on top of you. So this should help slightly with that situation, and make the fight a little bit different as well. A little bit of a new experience, an enhanced experience, if you will, where the Unskinned may pinball you a little bit more, but you'll be able to escape most of those situations, if not all of those situations, by rolling through the orb itself, if it's in your way. And if it's in the sky, you can just walk around. Karstjaw recovers faster after using his sword summon attack. So Karstjaw has an attack where he summons swords from the ground. They fling you up, they do some damage, you drop on the ground, you're no longer capable of taking damage when you're in the downed on your back position. So once you're in the down position, you're safe. This attack, therefore, was kind of a one-hit skill that you just kind of sat there and it reset the fight quite heavily. So this attack, I believe, took something like 6 seconds for him to start and finish. Now it's been reduced to something like 4.5 or 5 seconds. It's been reduced by something like 35% in its total animation, with about 80% of the change being after the swords are actually summoned. So he just moves through the animation a little bit faster. There's less frames in the animation, less keyframe time hold in the animation. So what does this mean in the actual combat scenario? You can get up from the hit and he can summon another sword attack and he can chain this. So you can get unlucky, but in the normal circumstance, it just means that he's not standing still for 6 seconds while he does this attack, which Karsja can be killed in those 6 seconds quite easily in many normal circumstances. So here we go. Consumables. Looks like we have enough time to fill out. Consumables. All focus restoration items now gain a small bonus per willpower. It's 50% bonus at the willpower soft cap of 50 willpower. Taking most or many from, say, 40 focus regeneration to 64 focus regeneration or restoration. The travel horn has been increased in cost, and the bell of return has been decreased in cost. I personally like when things have a cost value to them. So having travel horns not be just simply a no-brain constant use, at least in the early game, means that you have to actually plan out what you're doing. Now, I don't know if a lot of players paid attention to this or used it that much, but when you use a travel horn, you can only go to a place where a guide is. But when you have a guide, you can go to any sanctuary you visited for free. As long as you can get to the guide, you can go to any sanctuary. So strategically placing your guides is going to be much more valuable than using tons of horns, because you can go back and forth between different locations. And all statues are farmable in Enhanced, so keep that in mind as well. Devara Red Potion Protection buff has been increased from 10 seconds to 15 seconds. Devara is, in many ways, obsoleted by holy spells, holy abilities. And so I wanted to give the Creed something extra. And I couldn't really see a lot of ways to buff the orange file because it's already amazingly powerful. It has an antidote built in. It gives health. It gives focus. So the red potion has this protection buff where it doubles your defense for 10 seconds when you use a regular health potion. A regular health potion also heals over 5 seconds. So it lasts for just a little bit longer. Well, it lasts for twice as long as the actual healing process. So now it lasts for 3 times as long as the healing process, which means that you can use it in more of a defensive strategic value. You can pre-buff yourself and have it last a little bit longer. And I'm a big fan of buffs and effects not being really, really short. I like in Salt and Sanctuary that a lot of the weapon buffs are 30 or even 60 seconds long. Quite powerful. And it doesn't mean you have to rush. You can take your time, you can breathe, you can think, as would be expected from especially the earlier Souls games. Red Grass now also has a bonus to it. I wanted the Stone Roots to have something valuable in them. They have a lot of very valuable items to purchase, both in Classic and now Enhanced also. You can get the Dexterity Ring from them at level 2 for 500 gold. From their merchant. You do need the merchant. But yeah, their healing potion now is 20% stronger, even though it takes twice as long to heal. So you're healing for 60% kind of instead of 50% in the sense of time there. This does, in a way, make the Alchemist an easier boss if you don't take over the shrine. So take that for what you will. The Bluegrass consumable grants a buff over 5 seconds that heals your focus. So instead of getting 40 instantly like other creeds, you will get 40 over 5 seconds. This has both detriments and benefits. If you're trying to do certain things and you're already kind of at the cap, you can kind of pre-buff the bluegrass and then use some spells and have it kind of slowly refill. Hardy roll, Iron Ones. Iron Ones felt like they had this really strong identity that didn't really do anything. The Hardy roll now uses faster healing, a new healing buff that has been added, which has a 1 second duration instead of 5 seconds. So faster healing is 1 second, normal healing is 5 seconds, and slow healing is 10 seconds. Hardy roll uses the chew animation, where he chews the roll, which I believe is either 1 frame faster or 1 frame slower than the normal drink or sip animation that the characters have. But once you get that point of consumption, the healing is almost instantaneous. Not quite instantaneous, but almost instantaneous. And potions in Salt and Sanctuary heal 100% of your max HP over their duration. So 100% over 1 second. You get back to the fight instantly. And that was kind of the design here. Mana crystals are also changed. They now give 30 focus over 30 seconds instead of 40 focus instantly. The Iron Ones abhor magic, and yet they have all this magic stuff because they have this apostate mage as their vendor. Anyways, so they do have quite a bit of magic. Even though they abhor magic, they still have access to a lot of it. So what does this change to Mana Crystal do? It grants the focus over a very long duration, which means that at the beginning of a fight, you can pop this and then just not care about fatigue. That's the intention, at least. Instead of being focused on using this Mana Crystal primarily for magic, it is now kind of focused more towards fatigue. But it also means that you're just going to regenerate slowly. So you can pop it and just not care. It is weaker than other focused potions. So if you are a mage and you're using the Mana Crystal, you do need to manage your focus a little bit. And willpower, again, still buffs that from this this thing here. So it will go to 45 focus over 30 seconds at 50 willpower. The Mountain Warhorn and the Warhorn Stamina Regen, both. The difference between the Creed version and the non-Creed version is the duration is doubled for the Creed version. So the Stamina Regen has been reduced from 135 to 100. That's per second, by the way. That's a lot of stamina. Regeneration has a pause whenever you do certain actions, such as swinging a sword might have a pause for 0.8 seconds or 0.9 seconds. So during that pause, the Warhorn actually gave a regeneration state that did not care. It completely ignored that pause. So that action pause regen has been increased from 15 to 25. So while I've decreased it by 35, the unpausable regen is significantly larger. Again, the idea is you go into the fight and you don't want to stop fighting. You're not going to knock down the Iron Ones. They're strong, they're sturdy like a mountain. And you just keep fighting. You just won't really run out of stamina with this. As well, both Warhorns now give a 50% bonus of poise. You have to have actually poise on your character to get that value out of it. And now Warhorns grant that difference of previous and new max instantly if the buff was not actively used previously. Using it over and over and over will refresh the maximum, but if you let it wear out entirely, it will then refresh to full on the current value of poise as well. So just a way to manipulate poise a little bit there. Now understand that every time you get staggered or every time an enemy gets staggered, your poise is reset to 100%. Some enemies just have really low or no poise, so they get staggered on every hit. The UI has been updated to show this poise change when you use the Warhorns. So you can actually see the difference. Wine, all of them. The drunkenness increased from 30 flat damage. That's a buildup of 30 flat damage, by the way. So you would have to drink multiple potions, and each potion gives 30% or 30 damage. So when you actually finally popped the drunkenness debuff, which is poison damage, you might have like 120 damage to burn through from the drunken status. That has been changed to 20% max HP per drink. 20% is approximately the same as 30 damage in New Game. This just means it scales through the other 7 New Game Plus difficulties. It's not a get out of jail free card anymore. Wine drunkenness is now also much more of a threat. Yeah, you can just choose an antidote anyway, but it is now 3 drinks instead of 4, which means that it's actually a threat. Blue wine now grants its focus as a buff, similar to, well, exactly the same as bluegrass. Golden wine no longer stacks with elemental buffs. So this was a corner case. Golden wine multiplies all damage by 50%. So 1.5x in classic. This created all sorts of situations with this kind of two-shotting effect where you could use things like Divine Blessed Weapon with the Obsidian Pillar and all this other stuff. And you could hit like 1100 damage a hit. Now, enemies have resistances, so they weren't actually taking 1100 damage. This no longer stacks. So Golden Wine gives 35% damage, just like every other item buff. So if you use the fire buff from the 3 or the holy buff from Devara, they give 35% in enhanced. But if you use an elemental buff while Golden Wine is active, it will take the elemental buff instead as the damage. You will get all the other bonuses, defense bonus, the gold bonus, things like that. It will only override the damage. And so it's just assuming, as a designer myself, I am assuming that if you use both, you want the elemental damage over the physical, the primarily physical focused Golden Wine damage. And that is meant to cut a corner case out of the game. So instead of doing 1100 damage with certain specific weapons, you will probably now do something like 450 in the exact same setup. So it is a massive nerf to that corner case, but you're still going to be one-shotting every enemy in the game except for like 3 or 2, and you'll still be able to do something like a 9-shot on the final boss or something close to that, instead of a 2 or 3 shot. Golden Wine no longer grants poison resist. I found this kind of backwards because, first of all, the House of Splendor, they are all suffering from gray rot. That is their lore. They're suffering from basically leprosy of some form. Gray rot. And they can't get rid of it. And they have all these healing potions and all this magic and all this whatever you want to call it. And I felt that the drunkenness was playing into that as well, the gray rot. So the drunkenness is reduced by poison resist. In all effects, it is poison damage. So it just has a different icon, and it's still green, of course. So Golden Wine no longer grants poison resist, which means that if you do get poisoned from the drunkenness, which is now a bit more threatening, you actually have to care about it a little bit more. You're not just going to pop Golden Wine and then be mildly immune to poison. Golden Wine now also grants additional damage if using a purely physical weapon. Like the fire buff and the lightning buff and all those other things, they grant a bonus, both in classic and enhanced, though the ratios are different. See episode 2 for that. So if matched with a physical weapon, if Golden Wine is used on a purely physical weapon like the Claymore, you will get 42% bonus damage instead of 35. And understand that this was a nerf. It's mentioned in the previous video. This is a nerf from Golden Wine's 50% damage buff in the past. So Golden Wine, as an offset from some of the other changes here, the poison resist change and the damage change, now has a 25% bonus poise damage change, which means that it is relatively strong with great weapons still, much like its past existence. Still good with all weapons, but it's specifically good when you're trying to do poise damage. Cleansing Cloth has been kind of reworked. It now grants fatigue healing, which is literally just focus. Fatigue and focus are basically just opposites of each other. Fatigue is the consumption of focus. So every time you run, jump, attack, whatever, you increment a small amount of focus consumption. Whereas if you're using a spell, you actually use a huge burst of focus consumption. So Cleansing Cloth now grants 5 fatigue healing. This is kind of like the orange file of the House of Splendor, and it also removes 50% of wounds. You also only get 1 per turn in instead of 2, which means that while it's stronger, it's meant to be weaker in the sense of being less. The purpose of Cleansing Cloth is that it removes all debuffs from your character, including drunkenness, instantly. So by using this, I figured there's nothing in the game that actually reduces wounds, like removes them, other than 1 spell. Well, the 3 men's and then Sacred Linens both. So because the Grey Rot, again, the lore here, I wanted to tie it in here. Because the Grey Rot, it makes no sense that if I gave them a pure wound healing thing, then wouldn't they be using that to heal themselves of the Grey Rot? So instead, it removes a percentage of wounds, which means that you will never fully be wound-free, just as they will never fully be rid of the Grey Rot. That's my tie-in for why I chose 50% instead of a flat value there. So Flask of Fire now has a minimum healing of 50% max HP. Flask of Fire is a weird situation. So in the alpha or beta of the original game, Assault and Sanctuary, each creed had flat healing. And each creed was sort of meant to be, in a way, kind of a tier. So later creeds gave better healing. But Flask of Fire was left as a flat value, as were the Mending Prayers. Flask of Fire now has a minimum healing of 50% max HP. So it has a healing of 150 life over 5 seconds instead of the normal 100% life over 5 seconds that most other potions do. And in this circumstance, as you get more and more health, as you move through, say, New Game Plus, especially New Game Plus 2 and beyond, you're going to have more and more health, and Flask of Fire will be weaker and weaker and weaker. But now it has a minimum healing, so that at least it's somewhat functional in New Game Plus. And then Defiled Flask. This goes both ways. It no longer creates a weird multiplier of 25% damage on top of the armor removal. I've got some math here. I'm going to focus it here. In the case of, say, the Nameless God, who has 500 defense to all the elemental and poison damage types, this creates a 71% reduction effect. When you use Defiled Flask doesn't work on holy damage, holy defense, but it works on everything else. A Defiled Flask removes all defense that is positive, taking it to 0. So 500 goes to 0. So 200 armor equals 100% extra survivability, or in other words, it needs twice as many hits. If you have 400 armor, you need 200% extra hits, or 300 total times. In this situation, 500 over 200 is the effective health percentage of a 350% increased damage value. So because you're doing 71% less damage, you're doing 28% total damage. When you remove that health or remove that armor, you do 100% damage instead. So going from 28.5% to 100%, you have increased your damage by 3.5 times. Do I need to then multiply it by 25%? I don't think so, personally. So I moved this back in patch 10, and this goes both ways because Blood Magic does the exact same thing. And Blood Magic, when you're using Blood Magic, you get debuffed with this effect, and it removes all your defenses, including the defenses you gain per level. So it truly removes all your defense. It's not just removing your armor or your rings or something like that. So this means Defiled Flask is weaker, just kind of like how Golden Wine is weaker. But the difference is this. I didn't allow the multiplier to continue to exist. So instead of doing 439% bonus damage, you will only do 350%. Only 350%. So that is the change to Defiled Flask. It's still probably one of the best consumables in the game, unless you're dealing with Murdiella. So that's it for this episode. We will cover more in another episode, and I will probably cover literally everything that is remaining. So it might be a little bit longer. It might be the same length. Hope this helped break down my patches for Salt and Sanctuary a little bit. Hope it gave you some insight in how I think, why I did things. I know a lot of people really enjoy Enhanced, so I hope you're really enjoying it as well. Thanks for stopping by.